So let's take a second look at Plato's Euthyphro. This is obviously kind of a difficult assignment. I think in terms of fitting this into the structure of the weekly assignment. But certain choices would need to be made to actually say what is Plato's overall point here. What is it that he's trying to establish, and how does he do so? It's difficult, but let's take a look at a little more detail on the reasoning that is here in the Euthyphro. First of all, there is an introduction here, and it's actually quite worth reading. The translator here is Benjamin Jowett, who is a Victorian Englishman, I believe, kind of late 19th century, mid to late 19th century classicist and very influential translator of Plato and other works from Greek philosophy and literature. And the introduction, presumably written by him, quite worth reading actually, but not part of the assignment. Assignment starts here with Plato's actual dialogue. First thing to say about the Euthyphro, and this is true of any Platonic dialogue, is it breaks itself up into parts. There is no one direct, overall, continuous argument here. That is a matter of interpretation once you look at all the little arguments and try to figure out what exactly Plato is up to here. I think that when we're thinking about it and trying to get a handle on it, one of the things we do is to break it up into parts. And the first part is clearly this introductory part in which Socrates and Euthyphro bump into each other, and each of them explains why he is at the court. This begins right here, beginning of the dialogue. Socrates explains that he's been indicted for charges of impiety. Euthyphro explains that he is there to prosecute a case, to begin a prosecution against his own father for murder. Socrates is shocked by this, very, like what are you talking about? Why would you do such a thing? Because the whole idea of a son indicting his own father for a criminal act is rather startling. It's not an everyday occurrence. Euthyphro explains the circumstances, what's brought him there. Socrates is again rather shocked by the whole thing, with Euthyphro's implication is that he is doing this thing because he believes that it is the pious thing to do, that piety demands, which is essentially his responsibility to the gods, demand that he bring this case against his own father. And Socrates ends this little introductory part, this sort of setup part of the dialogue, by saying, okay, you're saying that what you're doing is the pious thing to do, and that to not do it, to not bring your father up on charges under these circumstances would be impious. Euthyphro is like, yeah, sure. And so Socrates asks the question, okay, well, if you are so sure that what you're doing is pious and to do anything else would be impious, tell me, he says right here, what is piety and what is impiety? So there is not only the end of the introductory setup part of the dialogue, but also the beginning of a philosophical conversation. And this is very typical of the kind of thing that Socrates does in the Platonic dialogue, especially the early ones. Somebody, by implication, claims to know what something is. And Socrates says, okay, well, if you know what it is, then tell me what it is, which is a process, process of definition, really. Well, I mean, if you if you are so sure that what you're doing is pious here, you must know what piety is. Well, just go ahead and tell me. And that really, again, is the end of the introductory part and the beginning of really the philosophical part. Because now the conversation is not about the particular circumstances of either of these two men. It is an abstract philosophical investigation into the nature of something, in this case, the nature of the pious. So, yes, it is right here that philosophy proper really begins. This is such a essential Plato question, Socrates question. What is this? What is that? The what is question. It was a central thing in what Socrates did, that question. And Euthyphro's response to it is important because on the one hand he says, not on the one hand, he says that in answer to it, he says, well, what I'm doing now is piety. That's what piety is, prosecuting someone who's guilty of murder. And by the way, if you're shocked by the fact that it's my own father, well, Zeus himself punished his father for wrongdoing. So he's got the backing of the gods here. There's the two very important things that Euthyphro says that need to be kept in mind. Because the first thing that Socrates responds to is, do you really believe these stories about the gods fighting each other? Gods being in conflict? Because Socrates has a problem with that. And that's important, right, that he has a problem with that, because one of the things that this dialogue is a commentary on Greek religion at the time. And Socrates is certainly not rejecting it, but there's certain aspects of it that he clearly finds problematic. And one of them is the idea that gods could disagree and fight with each other. The other thing, again, is this idea that this way that Euthyphro actually responds to the what is piety question by saying what I'm doing now is piety. And this is perhaps even more important when Socrates says here, he says, remember that I did not ask you to give me 2 or 3 examples of piety, but to explain the general idea which makes all pious things to be pious. Which is very important. This happens in a lot of dialogues where Socrates will ask somebody to define something like piety or justice or knowledge or the beautiful or something like that. And what people will do, they'll point to an example. And Socrates says, well, fine, that may be true, but that's not what I'm asking you to do. I'm not asking you to give me an instance or an example of this thing. I'm asking you to define what it is in itself, the general idea or concept. And that really kind of starts us off in terms of the definitions of piety that Socrates begins to look at from Euthyphro when Euthyphro offers them. And Euthyphro gives this sort of definition. This is of the form that Socrates wants. Right? Maybe Socrates doesn't think that it's correct, but at least it's in the right form in the sense that it gives that definition of a general concept rather than pointing to examples, sort of supposed examples. Euthyphro says piety then is that which is dear to the gods, and impiety is that which is not dear to them, which is really not bad definition, at least in terms of if you're familiar with the word piety, which most of us really aren't, because it's a word that is just not in a kind of a post-religious culture, I would say, more or less. It's not a word that is used very often because it is a specifically religious word. But as far as my grasp of the use of the word, certainly Euthyphro's definition is not outrageously bad or obviously false or anything, but Socrates Socrates immediately begins to sort of break this down. So Euthyphro says piety is that which is dear to the gods, or piety is what the pious is what the gods love, and impiety is that which is not dear to them, or the impious is that which they do not love, or that which they hate. first problem here is just, Socrates says, well, you've admitted that the gods are in conflict with each other sometimes. And if they're in conflict with each other, they must have disagreements. And the kind of disagreements that they would have are likely about what is lovable and what's not. So if one God loves one thing and the other God hates the same thing, then the same thing will be both pious and impious, because you defined the pious as that which the gods love, and the impious is that which they hate. So if different gods love and hate different things, then the same thing will be at the same time both pious and impious, which that couldn't possibly be true. So when Socrates says, then the same things are hated by the gods and loved by the gods, and are both hateful and dear to them. And Socrates says, and upon this view, the same things, Euthyphro, will be pious and also impious, which that just breaks the most fundamental rule of logic. Principle of non-contradiction. Same thing can't both be and not be the same thing and its opposite at the same time in the same respect. So something basically it just couldn't be. But this objection on the part of Socrates is fairly easily dealt with. And that is to say, well, let's just say that the pious is that which all the gods love. Where does he say that? Well, that's more or less what they come to here. And that really, I would say, once they resolve that, then that sort of ends the second part of it. Because Socrates kind of brings up a new subject. After he winds this discussion up, where he says, but I will amend the definition so far as to say that what all the gods hate is impious, and what they love pious or holy, and that what some of them love and others hate is both or neither. And so that sort of clears up this problem. But then a new, and that sort of ends that section, the sort of second section, I would call it, of the dialogue. And then something quite new is brought in, and this becomes really maybe the central point of the whole dialogue, where Socrates says right here, the point which I should first wish to understand is whether the pious or holy is beloved by the gods because it is holy, or holy because it is beloved of the gods. And this leads into this whole other. So I'd say the third part of the dialogue is really what's initiated here, where Socrates asks this question. And that question is, the way that it's a little tricky in the wording, clearly. But Socrates goes to some pains to try to explain himself as particularly as he can, what this distinction actually means. This example of something that is carrying as opposed to something that's carried. But it's pretty clear, what he's getting at here, what sort of question he's asking. And that is whether the pious is pious because it's loved by the gods. That is it the loving from the gods that makes it pious? Or do they love it because it's pious? That is, it's not their loving it that makes it pious. It just is pious, and they love it because it's pious. It's actually, I would say, a fairly simple point, but really a crucial one. And especially if we think about its relationship to religion and morality and things like that. it has relevance to all sorts of questions about that relation and whether that which is good because it's loved by the gods, or whether the gods love it because it's good. There are very definite differences and implication depending on which of those choices you know you accept, you opt for. So to try to wind this up, sorry this is going so long. I would say that the third part of the dialogue is this explanation and exploration of this distinction between something being something in itself and something being something because of the action of someone else, that is. And that's the question of piety. Is the pious because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it's pious? That's really the third part. The fourth, and I would say last part, happens after that is discussed. And Euthyphro kind of tries to change the subject here, right here, where he says, I really do not know, Socrates, how to express what I mean, for somehow or other our arguments, on whatever ground we rest them, seem to turn round and walk away from us. And there's some joking back and forth about that. He's getting confused, clearly, Euthyphro, and maybe a little tired of this discussion. But Socrates doesn't want to let it go. And really the fourth part of the dialogue begins here. He says, tell me then, is not that which is pious necessarily just? Yes. And is then all which is just pious, or is it that which is pious all just, but that which is just only in part or not all pious? You see what he's trying to do here. He's trying to get Euthyphro to think about the relationship between piety and justice, and which is the more comprehensive concept. Clearly, Socrates is arguing that justice is, that piety is part of justice, and justice is a wider thing. So everything which is pious is also just. But some things which are just are not pious. You can think of, he's arguing that the pious is like a subset of the just, as he says, just like the odd is a subset of number. Everything which is odd is also number, but not everything which is number is odd. Everything which is pious is just, but not everything which is just is also pious. There's an exploration of that. And then he says, well, what part of justice is piety? Trying to get him to think of, maybe a little bit more systematically about the thing. And then comes really interesting, I would say, the last argument in inquiring into the nature of, well, what sort of justice is piety. Remember, justice is, in its general sense, is giving everyone what is due to them. So this is general idea of what is due to the gods from human beings. And Euthyphro sort of scrambles through this, basically saying that piety is a kind of a service to the gods. But that, to Socrates, doesn't really make a lot of sense either. What kind of service would perfect beings like the gods really need from human beings? Which pretty much ends up showing that Euthyphro, this idea of Euthyphro, that piety is serving the gods, is really kind of a useless thing. And okay, and then we get to the end, and Euthyphro kind of begs off, and the conversation just ends very abruptly. When Socrates obviously doesn't think they're finished, but Euthyphro's done. After all this, what do you think the dialogue is trying to establish? Well, it's up to you. Again, there are individual arguments here that definitely have particular structures, and I've tried to go through them in basically the latter three parts of the dialogue are philosophical. The first part is really an introductory thing, and in those three parts there are particular arguments that Socrates offers about piety. There's no one overall argument. There may be an overall thrust to the dialogue, and that's a matter of interpretation. Now, one thing I think is undeniable is that Socrates really means to show Euthyphro that he is not clear at all on what piety is. And of course, this has very immediate implications for what he's doing at the courthouse.